I first heard about Craigslist in the aftermath of the attacks in 2001 because of a lot of information and photos were being posted there. The pictures and video people were uploading were just insane, and the actual first-hand eyewitness accounts being posted on Craigslist NYC was even crazier. Like, some people said how a man in a business suit ran past them, his tie was on fire but he didn't seem to notice, and another described the people emerging from the dust as like statues coming to life. That's what got me into the habit of logging on every day. And then after I ran out of new pictures to stare at or new accounts of the attack to read, I'd inevitably end up switching back to the Craigslist page of my hometown to browse the local listings. I was a regular visitor to the free section or the for sale listings because you could find some real gems on that thing. Then the fix-it and frugal posts in the discussion section could be pretty useful too, but the section that I found myself visiting daily without fail were the temporary jobs listings. There used to be some real easy ways of making money. You could get paid for taking part in studies or surveys about everything from binge eating to depression. And then one time, some big beauty company paid me to rub moisturizer all over my face and then just give my thoughts about it. There used to be a bunch of small home repair jobs too, which were a great way to make a quick $30 here and there. Some folks just needed to borrow a ladder and would pay $10 in gas money for me to drive over there so they could just change the damn battery on their smoke alarm and stop it from beeping every 30 seconds. But then you'd get your weirder temp job posts, and I remember seeing one that said, "Earn $100 by sending a text." The post said something like, "Totally legit, email below," but I was convinced it was a scam. I just couldn't figure out how. So, out of pure curiosity, I hit up the email address provided with a short but very polite inquiry. I received an email back pretty quickly, basically explaining that it was totally legit and I'd be wired money upon the text message's delivery. Still unconvinced, I just sort of humored the guy and asked what he wanted me to say. He then sent me the cell number that he wanted me to text, along with the exact wording that I should use, and it was just 3 words. I see you. And I chose not to reply. I just deleted the email thread, flagged the post, and went back to browsing. But I'd be lying if I said that I wasn't just a little freaked out. I later noticed that the post was gone, but back then, Craigslist only had a skeleton crew for a moderating team, so I'm honestly not sure if it was taken down because it got flagged so many times or because the job actually got completed. I guess it could have been nothing but a prank. But even so, that really was just the tip of the iceberg when it came to weird Craigslist advertisements. And over the next few years, I saw ads that were a whole lot stranger and in some cases, a whole lot darker too. Once Craigslist started to hit its peak traffic, so sometime between 2004 and 2009, you'd see a lot more weird posts, but a lot of them were either jokes or the first stage of some elaborate prank. I used to browse some of the wilder ones just for the funnies, but I felt like I got pretty good at telling the difference between a few high school kids having fun down at the computer lab and someone who needed serious psychiatric help. At least until I saw an ad that read, "Earn money by helping with medical treatment." Nothing about the title raised any flags for me at first because it was expected that you'd come across something unusual like that every so often. But again, out of pure curiosity, I clicked the post, read through the listing, and then started laughing my ass off at what OP had written. I can't remember exactly what it said, and I seriously wish that I'd taken a screenshot or some picture so I could tell you, but it was more or less something like this. The medical treatment OP was referring to was the amputation of his right leg. He wanted someone to drop by his apartment and basically spot him so he could remove his right leg below the knee without leaking all over the floor and taking a forever nap. He'd written that experience wasn't necessary because he'd coach you on how to tie the tourniquet and how to cauterize a wound, but that anyone who helped would be paid a cool $1,000. I realized the content is pretty dark, but the way OP had written the ad was nothing short of hilarious. Again, I wish I'd made a record of it before the post was finally taken down because it was written in such a self-aware and self-deprecating style that at first I thought it had to be a well-written satire. When I saw the attached email address read, "cash to cut off my leg" at AOL.com, I remember erupting into laughter and being entirely convinced that I was reading some kind of inside joke between medical students. I actually thought it was the funniest post that I'd ever really seen, and it tickled me so much that I figured that I'd send an email saying how much I actually appreciated it. It was almost like the poster was aware of how weird Craigslist ads could be and was basically mocking the whole system. Well, it turns out the guy had an awesome sense of humor, but his ad was not a joke. And so I send off this email saying something of the sorts of, "You guys gave me a chuckle. Keep up the great work." Then a few hours later, a reply flashed up in my inbox. Cash to cut off my leg, and for ease I'll just call him Cash from here on out, told me that while he was excited about me appreciating his bleak sense of humor, he expected serious inquiries only. He'd supposedly made that clear toward the end of his post, but all the unserious posts included those words and almost a calling card to indicate that they were just that, very unserious trolling. And you'd see stuff like, "seeking 10 gallons of breast milk, serious inquiries only," or "seeking someone to bite my hemorrhoids, serious inquiries only," to the point where almost all the truly serious posts made a point of not including that phrase in order to appear authentic. But then, even with Cash insisting that he was the real deal, I still had trouble believing someone was willing to pay me to help cut off their leg. I remember sending back a short and very honest message basically saying, "I appreciate the dedication to the joke, but I'm still not fooled." And Cash's reply came back within minutes again, and he assured me that his post was not a joke, claimed the amputation of his leg was something he'd been planning for years, and then added that he'd actually practiced such a procedure on one of his fingers. He then said that he didn't care if I doubted his authenticity, that he'd find someone to help eventually, and if that person wasn't me, then I should just kindly refrain from further emails. I don't know what I was expecting to read in reply, but it certainly wasn't something so concise and kind of believable. I say believable because he didn't attempt to creep or gross me out, well, not deliberately anyway. It was actually the opposite. His message was just polite and kind of tongue-in-cheek at first, and what's more, he made it crystal clear that he had nothing to prove to anyone. Normally, I'd have just ended an email chain once I figured out that the poster was either crazy or just trying to prank someone, but in this case, this guy had me fascinated. I didn't write a reply straight away. I'd actually resigned myself to doing what I'd mentioned, just disregard it, delete it, and then move on. But in Cash's case, I couldn't bring myself to just nuke the thread and be done with it. I think I knew in the back of my mind that I'd end up writing to him again. I just didn't count on the urge taking hold of me so soon. And I remember heading back to my computer and typing out some very long email that basically amounted to this. If his post was nothing more than an attempt at humor, then that was fine. But if he was truly genuine in his request, then I found him and his so-called medical treatment so incredibly fascinating. And then with that in mind, I asked if he was okay with me asking him some questions. Cash's reply didn't come so fast that time, but when it did, I was actually kind of excited to hear back from him. He said that very few people ever showed any genuine interest in him, and since I seemed so sincere, I was welcome to ask him anything I liked. I was still in very much two minds about this Cash guy being genuine. I figured he could be real, but it was far more likely that he was lying for some reason, and for my own peace of mind, I wanted to sort of catch him so I could put the whole thing to rest. I asked Cash a lot of questions over the week or so that followed, about all sorts of different stuff, but the gist of his answers was this. Back when he was in elementary school, a popular teenage boy in Cash's hometown was involved in a serious automobile accident. Lots of people heard about the kid getting all mangled up before they rushed him to a hospital, and for a while there, it was looking like his race was run, as they say. Somehow the kid pulls through, but when he showed up again, it was on crutches, because he lost one of his legs just above the knee. Cash said that all the way back then he remembered feeling different to everyone else, They either pitied the kid who lost his leg or were relieved that he pulled through all the surgeries that he had to go through. Whereas young Cash there, he didn't feel any pity or relief. He actually felt envy. He felt jealous that the one kid got all kinds of sympathy and privileges, and I mean, that was only right to support the new amputee as he settled into his new life. But I guess from Cash's perspective, it just kinda twigged something in his brain and made him associate the loss of limb with some kind of, I don't know, bugged positive feedback loop. Because ever since then, Cash had an obsession with people losing limbs and particularly their legs. It made for an incredibly intricate backstory and a disturbingly convincing one too, but I still wasn't convinced until Cash sent me a photographic evidence of what he called his auto amputation. Now, if you can cast your mind back, Cash mentioned something about performing an amputation on one of his fingers as a sort of dry run for his leg. Just like the car crash victim that he'd seen as a kid, he wanted his right leg amputated just above the knee, but he also knew how risky it'd be to try and pull off that kind of procedure at home, even with a spotter. And with that in mind, he wasn't about to jump onto the operating table with anyone, which was pretty understandable. But then, unable to resist myself while the topic of his finger amputation had been raised, I asked if I could see this photographic evidence. In his next reply, when Cash said, maybe some other time, my belief and disbelief ratio became seriously skewed, and from then on, I was mostly convinced Cash was lying to me. Then suddenly, right as I was on the verge of losing interest in someone I increasingly considered kind of a fraud, Cash sent me an email with 2 attachments, 1 photo and 1 video. Now, the photo was nothing but a hand with a series of letters written on it. I had to squint and zoom in to see what the letters said because the picture was of very poor quality, but after a few seconds of pondering it, the words became very clear. It said, "Cash to cut off my leg," and underneath, the same date the email had been sent was written there too, kind of like a proof of life hostage photo. But then the thing which almost had me audibly gasping was when I noticed how the pinky finger was missing. And right then, 2 thoughts wrestled in my head. The first was that Cash could have lost his pinky in 100 different ways. Hell, he could have been some bored gator rancher down in Florida, spinning up some Yankee up north, one hell of a yarn, as they say. But then, the other thought said something like, he knew you might think that, so he sent you a video of him doing it as proof. And I found myself almost hoping that that wouldn't be the case, that video would end up being sort of a live photograph to show the picture hadn't been photoshopped. But when I opened the file, I found it was exactly what I'd prayed it wasn't. A masked man was holding a pair of bolt cutters, and without going into too much gory detail, he used them to snip through his little finger just above the knuckle. I could barely watch, but I saw it, and the wound seemed like it was an exact match for the scar Cash displayed in the photo that he sent me. There could be no more doubt. This Cash guy was the real deal. But instead of satisfying my curiosity, I found myself insatiable and longed to know more about other amputation procedures Cash claimed to have been involved in. Cash was always careful to make himself as anonymous as possible, and he knew that the more he talked about things that he'd done and places he'd been, the more likely it was that I'd figure out his identity. But with that in mind, he told me about 1 or 2 things he'd taken part of, where it was him that had been the spotter, and sometimes people just wanted him there for moral encouragement and not even to physically participate. Such as the guy who snipped his junk off. Cash said that he did all the clamping and cutting himself. He just needed someone who understood his thinking there to talk him through it. But then another time, Cash helped a guy amputate his own leg, or rather, make it so that the hospital had no choice to amputate it for him. He and this dude he met on Craigslist loaded up a plastic trash bin with ice and water, and then the guy he met up with basically submerged his leg in ice for almost 20 hours. Now, Cash said it was his job to keep the guy's core warm so that he didn't go into hypothermia, And he also had to make sure the guy had snacks, fluids, and everything he needed to make sure that he didn't have to unsubmerge his leg. Now, being kept at freezing temperatures that long completely killed all the tissue, while keeping the man himself pretty safe. Cash then drove him to the hospital, and a couple of hours later, voila, a brand new, very happy amputee. What's more, Cash didn't take a penny from the guy. He helped out of the kindness of his heart. And honestly, I couldn't believe what I was reading. Or rather, I could, but I couldn't imagine getting that kind of satisfaction or fulfillment from having a limb removed. I asked Cash why people wanted this kind of thing, and he told me it was for a variety of reasons. Some people wanted to look on the outside like they felt on the inside, and after their limb of choice was removed, they disappeared from the amputation scene entirely. Others stuck around to help coach others through the process. But then according to the Cash, there was the third kind. The kind that had one limb removed and then another, until it was clear that they were on a very dangerous path. He knew one guy whose ambition was to be like a limbless pillow person, not out of any kind of overtly inward loathing either, but because he liked the idea of people having to tend to his every need. Another guy's dream was to have his severed head animated so he could watch someone butcher his body before finally being unplugged. Technologically speaking, that fantasy is obviously a few thousand years in the making, but it gave me a real insight into the kinds of people who drifted in and out of the auto-amputation scene. And after a while, I guess I kind of ran out of questions to ask while Cash's replies became less and less frequent. We'd keep in touch here and there, kind of like pen pals in a weird way, until one day, Cash emailed me to say that he'd found someone willing to help remove his leg. It sounds kind of twisted to think about it now, but I was actually kind of happy for him. I had already had my suggestion of therapy turned down before Cash gave me the stark warning of, "Do not try and save me, or I'll stop replying to your emails." I figured he was beyond saving at this point, and all he wanted in the world was to get that leg of his removed. And so, I don't know. Hearing that he was finally about to organize its removal, and with the help of a very willing participant, I was actually pretty excited for him, I guess. After all, it was do it quote-unquote properly, or risk messing it up and losing his life, and aside from his weird thing with auto-amputation, Cash didn't seem like a bad guy at all. He didn't give me too much detail, but he seemed close with his family, and he never said where, but I know he volunteered with some kind of charitable foundation. He also assured me that he had a sit-down with some job someplace so his amputation wouldn't affect his ability to take care of himself, and he never partook in an amputation if he believed it would affect a person's lifestyle too negatively. And it was surreal for me that someone with such a wild and sadistic streak could seem like such a well-rounded person in their regular life. But I guess God makes them in all different shapes and sizes and mindsets too. And the last time I ever spoke to Cash, he sent me an email that simply read, "Today's the day. I'll let you know how it goes." But he failed to send any kind of follow-up. I remember waiting anxiously, refreshing my inbox over and over, hoping for some kind of update, any sign that he was all right. And days turned into weeks, and then the silence became unbearable, and I remember sending him a flurry of follow-up emails in that time, each more desperate than the last. I begged him, over and over, to just let me know that he was okay, but the replies never came. I told myself that he had a sudden change of heart, that he realized what he was doing was insane, canceled his plans, and walked away from the AA scene for good. And I clung to that hope like a lifeline, imagining him finding clarity and getting help, and maybe even laughing off the whole ordeal in hindsight. But late at night, when the world was very still and quiet, darker thoughts would creep in. And deep down in that place I didn't want to acknowledge, I felt like I already knew the truth. He went through with it. And something had gone horribly, horribly wrong. The not knowing was the worst part. Did he fade away alone in some dingy motel? Did the tools that he relied on fail him at the worst possible moment? Or was it worse than that? Did he achieve what he wanted? only to realize too late the magnitude of his mistake. And it gnawed at me endlessly for a very long time, and I hoped a reply might one day find its way into my inbox. But it never has, and I think part of me knows for certain that I'll never hear from Cash from Craigslist ever again. Almost 20 years ago, I was about 6 months into living with my first serious boyfriend when I suggested that we adopt a puppy. I'd always wanted a dog, but I also knew it would be a great chance to see how ready for parenthood my boyfriend was. And so we adopted Oscar, a Jack Russell puppy, and after we both fell in love with him down at the pound. And from the moment we got him home, he became our very own tiny bundle of energy and mischief. With his bright eyes, perky ears, and playful demeanor, he kept us on our toes and filled each and every day with love, laughter, and reasonably small poops. But Oscar had a flaw, one big one, and while he adored my boyfriend and I, he despised the rats and mice that lived out back near our apartment building's dumpsters. We used to let him poop outside as part of his potty training, rewarding him with treats and petting him whenever he did so. But this one time, Oscar quite literally smelled a rat by the dumpsters, and since Jack Russells were basically bred to be little vermin killers, something in Oscar's genetic memory set him off the edge. He used to bark at the dumpsters every time we took him outside, and since our apartment was on the ground floor, that was a daily event. But if we thought that he went crazy over just the scent of rats, it was nothing compared to how he reacted when he actually saw one. After that, the back of our building became a war zone, and after Oscar chased a rat so hard that he tried jumping over a fence to pursue it, we knew that we couldn't risk taking him back there again. If he got over that fence, he'd be gone, and there'd be nothing between him and the highway, which, as you can imagine, wasn't a prospect that we wanted to entertain even for a second. Well, one day, the unthinkable happened. We woke up, and Oscar was gone. My boyfriend somehow failed to close the back door properly when he came home drunk the previous night, and then while we were asleep, Oscar had gotten out and had either jumped over the fence chasing those rats, had found a gap in it to wiggle through, or even worse, someone had stolen him. And I was distraught and so mad at my boyfriend. I didn't say a single word to him until he promised with all of his heart and soul to bring Oscar home or die trying. And yes, the die trying part was overly dramatic, but I appreciate how sorry he was, and I also appreciated the amount of effort he put into searching the neighborhood, knocking on doors and putting up missing posters. But my boyfriend didn't stop there. He even went so far as to upload a missing dog post on our local Craigslist page. In a post titled Lost Dog, my boyfriend uploaded a picture of Oscar along with his last known location. We also offered a reward to anyone who could reunite us with him, and then over the next 24 hours or so, I was asking, has anyone replied, about every 10 minutes or so. My boyfriend wouldn't say it, but I knew it was wrong to get my hopes up so much. Missing pet stories rarely ever end well, and I knew in my heart of hearts that my boyfriend was putting all that effort in purely out of guilt, not out of any genuine hope that we could bring Oscar home safely. But then, not even 48 hours later, my boyfriend got an email from someone who claimed to have found Oscar. The email basically said, "Hi there. I found a small dog wandering near the highway just the other day, so I put him in my truck and drove him home." A friend then told me about a lost dog post that she'd spotted on Craigslist, and after checking it for myself, I realized that the dog I found was Oscar. He even responds to that name. The emailer left a phone number for us to call him on, then, after dialing it, my boyfriend and I were both ecstatic. The man on the other end of the phone sounded much older than us and had a very gruff voice, but he was also exceptionally friendly. He told us he'd be taking care of Oscar in our absence, feeding him cooked chicken and taking him for very careful walks using a leash that he'd made out of rope. Once I'd made a note of his address and promised the man that we'd swing by in the next few hours, I hung up and the relief just poured over me. I thanked my boyfriend for all he'd done and told him that he was completely and utterly forgiven for letting Oscar slip out the back door. I then told him pretty much everything the guy had told me, but when I was done, there were 2 points my boyfriend seemed very unsure of. The first was that the guy had mentioned keeping Oscar in his basement, and to me this didn't raise any red flags as the guy didn't know how far along Oscar was with his potty training and was probably keeping him in his basement to contain any sort of mess. And I remember my boyfriend saying something like, "Oscar's in his basement? Why? If he's taking him for regular walks, Oscar won't even try to go to the bathroom on his couch. Why would he keep him in the basement?" And I told him my own opinions on it and how that didn't bother me too much. But then the next thing that seemed to sort of dampen my boyfriend's excitement was the area of town that this guy said that he lived at. He said something such as, "That's not a great part of town. You shouldn't go alone." Now, I wasn't born and raised where we were living at the time, so I'd always defer to him when it came to local knowledge, and I was more than happy to go alone if it meant him not having to cancel plans, but in the end, he insisted. A few hours later, as we were driving towards the man's address, the streets became increasingly desolate. The houses were old and sagging, many with boarded-up windows and overgrown yards. I checked the address again on my phone, hoping that I'd made a mistake, but no, it was right. My boyfriend pulled the car up to the curb in front of this very dilapidated house. The paint was peeling, the lawn was a jungle of just weeds, and the porch light flickered weakly even though it was still daytime. A man stood in the doorway, waving at us. He looked ordinary enough, mid-40s, wearing a flannel shirt and jeans, but something about him felt very off. The man smiled, showing crooked teeth, and said Oscar was downstairs, and he motioned for us to come inside. The house looked even worse up close. The windows were dirty, the porch creaked under my feet, and a faint mildew smell came from the open door. I stopped and looked at my boyfriend, and he gave me a small shake of his head. I asked if the man could just bring Oscar upstairs instead. His smile faded for a moment, but he said it was no problem and again told us to come in, sounding more insistent this time. My boyfriend spoke up, and his voice was firm as he said we wouldn't go inside, and that we'd wait outside instead. And the man's mood changed. He didn't seem as friendly anymore and looked a little annoyed. He said okay, and then went back into the house, leaving the door open. My boyfriend leaned over toward me and whispered that something felt very off and that we should just leave. I whispered back, saying that we couldn't just leave without checking if Oscar was really there, and my heart was pounding, torn between hope and fear. And we waited, but the man didn't come back. Minutes passed, and my boyfriend checked his watch. His face was serious as he said, "We're leaving." And before I could say anything, the man came back to the doorway, and his face was blank now, no sign of the friendliness from earlier. He asked very flatly if we weren't coming in after all, and my boyfriend repeated that we weren't, and we started to walk away. But the man just stared at us as we left. Then as we reached the car, he called out in a very casual tone, but something about it felt wrong, like there was more behind his words, and we drove off in silence. My chest felt tight, and I couldn't decide if I was more upset or just uneasy. After a while, my boyfriend broke that silence, and he said he didn't think the man ever even had Oscar. The house, the neighborhood, the way that guy acted, it all just seemed like some big trap. And the thought made my skin crawl in all of the confusion of that day, and I couldn't stop wondering what might have happened if we had gone inside. And that night I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying everything, especially the way the man's face changed when we said no. I kept asking myself what would have happened if we'd stayed, and the next morning still felt uneasy. I looked up that house online, and my stomach dropped when I saw that it had been foreclosed years ago. It wasn't supposed to have anyone living inside of it. I called the police and told them what happened, and they said they checked it out, but they didn't seem very worried, I guess. A week later, an officer called me back, and they said they'd found something in the house, but wouldn't say what. All they told me was that I was lucky not to have gone inside. We never found Oscar, and sometimes late at night I think about that man in that doorway. I wonder how many people weren't as lucky as us and how close I came to being one of them. Back when I was younger, a little reckless and eager to find love, I thought it'd be a great idea to check out the personal section on Craigslist. Most of the ads I saw were either blatantly fake or downright creepy, but after scrolling for a while, one caught my eye. It was very short and straightforward. Looking for something casual, just broke up with my boyfriend, don't want anything serious, message me if you're interested. Something about it seemed genuine and the attached photo sealed the deal. And this girl was gorgeous, like sort of way out of my league, so I decided that I'd send her a message. She replied almost immediately and things moved fast, really fast, and within a few exchanges she was sending provocative pictures. And I really couldn't believe my luck, but something felt off, like it was way too good to be true. Now, half joking, I sent her a message, "If this is real, send me a picture with my name written on a piece of paper." And to my shock, she did, and that was really all the proof I needed to know that she was real. We kept talking, and she told me that she wasn't looking for anything serious, just a no-strings-attached hookup. Her ex had just moved out, and she wasn't ready for a relationship. She just wanted to have some fun. She then gave me her address and told me to come over. And to make sure everything was legit, I called her, and she answered on the first ring, and her voice was just as alluring as her photos. She said that she was at home, waiting for me. It all felt like a dream that I was going to wake up from at any second, but it wasn't. It was real. When I pulled up to that address, it was a quiet suburban neighborhood. The house looked normal, with a nearly trim lawn and a long driveway. I called her again to let her know that I was there. No answer. I tried again, and still nothing. I started to feel uneasy, but I was convincing myself that I was overthinking. Maybe she was just in the bathroom or had stepped away from her phone. Trying to shake off the nerves, I got out of the car and walked toward the house, and that's when I saw them. 2 men were standing in the window, staring me down as I walked up the driveway. They each looked extremely sketchy, like they'd stepped straight out of a police lineup, and one had a shaved head and a sort of scowl, while the other was very wiry, with tattoos covering his arms. And my blood immediately ran cold. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to get out of there, and without a second thought, I turned and sprinted back to my car. My heart pounded as I jumped in, locked the doors, and just sped off. My hands were shaking, and I couldn't stop glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see them chasing after me. When I finally got home, I tried to calm myself down. Maybe it was a misunderstanding, and maybe those guys had nothing to do with her. But deep down, I knew better. About an hour later, I got a text from the girl. "You're a loser," it read. "That was my boyfriend, and we were just messing with you." I stared at the message, feeling a mix of anger and relief. So much for the ex part, right? And I tried to brush it off as some sick joke, and they probably got a kick out of scaring guys like me. It was messed up, sure, but at least I was okay, I guess. But a few days later, the local news told a much darker story. A man had answered a Craigslist ad in that same neighborhood, and when he showed up, 2 men ambushed him. They beat him, robbed him, and left him barely alive, and he ended up in the hospital fighting for his life. The police said it was a setup, and in the description of the house matched the one that I had been at, and a very cold chill ran down my spine. I couldn't stop thinking about how close I'd come to being their victim. If I hadn't noticed those guys in the window, I might not have made it out, and the thought haunted me for a while. These weren't just pranksters messing around. They were predators, willing to hurt someone for a quick payday. They lured me in with fake promises and a pretty face, and I'd almost fallen for it. Even now I can't shake the memory. The way those men stared at me, unblinking, as if I'd already been caught in their trap, and the relief that I felt when I drove away was replaced by a very sickening realization. I'd been extremely lucky. The man on the news wasn't so fortunate, and I can't help but wonder how many had fallen for that exact same trap. I met him through a Craigslist personals ad. His posts weren't anything fancy, just kind of awkward and sweet, and it said something like, "Looking for someone to grab a drink with, laugh a little, and see where it goes?" And it caught my attention because it felt real. And we started swapping emails, and he came off as funny and kind, maybe a little rough around the edges, but not really in a bad way. Then, after a week of chatting, we agreed to meet up in person. The bar was crowded, but we found a quiet corner to sit and talk, and right away, I noticed that he had this natural charm about him. He was funnier and way more engaging in person than I expected. He made me laugh, and the way he listened and responded made it feel like he'd be a great listener and maybe at some point in the future, a very attentive boyfriend. And as the night went on, he suggested heading to a nearby pool hall so we could continue enjoying one another's company. And I thought, why not? I had driven, so I offered to take him there. At the pool hall, we played a few games and the conversation kept flowing. He'd made me laugh, so much so that I almost forgot that we'd only just met. And then suddenly, his phone buzzed on the table and he looked at the screen and his face sort of dropped and then everything changed. "I need to tell you something," he said. And I froze, not really sure what was coming. "I'm a convicted felon, and I just got out of prison." And my mind started spinning. I didn't even have time to process that before he said, "And I have a girlfriend. I live with her, but it's not serious. I'm just staying there until I get back on my feet." And I was completely blindsided. This man who had been charming and funny all evening had just thrown all of this at me like it was no big deal. Then he added one more thing. "She just texted me. She walked into the bar earlier and saw us together, and she knows I'm with you." In that moment, I knew the date was over. I wanted to get out of there, but I'd driven us, and I didn't feel right just leaving him stranded. I told him that I'd take him back to his car, but the vibe on the drive was completely tense and uncomfortable. And as we drove, the alcohol must have really hit him because he started crying. Just quiet tears at first, but then it turned into full-on sobbing. He kept apologizing over and over, saying how much he regretted everything, and I didn't know what to say. And then out of nowhere, he reached for the car door handle. And a panic rose up inside of me, and I yelled, "We're on the goddamn highway!" And he didn't seem to care. He was crying so hard, and it was like he wasn't even hearing me. And I hit the child locks as fast as I could. I yelled at him, trying to stay calm, but inside I was terrified. I didn't know what he was going to do next. The rest of the drive felt like it took forever, and he kept mumbling and crying, and I just focused on getting us back to the bar as fast as possible. When we finally got there, I let him out and watched him stumble to his car, and as soon as he was out of sight, I just drove away as fast as I could. I thought that was the end of it. But a few days later, I got a message from an unknown number. It was his girlfriend, and my stomach dropped. She sent pictures of her face, bruised and swollen with a split lip, and she told me he'd beaten her up after our date. She'd confronted him about seeing me, and that's how he reacted, and I felt sick. This man who had made me laugh and seemed so sweet at first was a violent monster. I couldn't believe that I'd spent an entire evening with him, laughing and having fun, all while being completely unaware of what he was capable of. His soon-to-be ex-girlfriend and I started talking more and more after that, and she told me all about the things he'd done to her, and it was horrifying. Then not long after, she left him for good, and we actually became friends. It's strange how something so terrible can lead to something good, but I guess that's life. And that night changed me. I learned to trust my gut and pay attention to those red flags. If something feels off, it probably is. And looking back, I can't believe how close I came to being another one of his victims, and it serves as a reminder to be careful and to never underestimate what someone is capable of. I stumbled across the link on a Craigslist psych discussion forum. I wasn't looking for anything specific, just killing time scrolling through threads on lucid dreaming and conspiracies about subliminal messaging. And then I saw the post. Live feed, smiling man, watch if you dare. It had a single link, no description, and a sense of weirdness that kind of pulled me in, and against my better judgment, I clicked on it. The stream loaded quickly, revealing a man sitting in a plain wooden chair in the middle of an empty room, and the lighting was flat and harsh, giving the whole scene a very clinical vibe. He was staring directly at the camera, unblinking, with the kind of smile you'd expect from someone trying too hard in a family photo. It wasn't quite unsettling at first, it was just kind of strange, and I waited for him to do something. A wave, a twitch, a shift in his seat, anything, but he didn't. He just sat there, his wide eyes locked on the lens, his lips frozen in that eerie grin, and I checked the timestamp. It was live. I remember thinking, well, this is weird, while glancing at the chat window. It was empty, no viewers except for me, and curiosity kept me from watching. Now 5 minutes turned into 10, and then 20. He didn't move once. No blinking, no fidgeting, nothing. It was like he was frozen in time except for the faint rise and fall of his chest. The longer I stared, the more unnatural it felt, as if he were daring me to keep looking. And then suddenly, I heard a noise. At first I thought it was my imagination, but it grew louder, a faint creak like footsteps on old wood. But the man didn't react. The sound got louder, footsteps echoing faintly in the stream, coming from somewhere out of view. A shadow flickered across the far wall of the room and my stomach tightened. Someone was there. Someone else. I leaned closer to the screen and my pulse was quickening. A figure appeared, blurry at first, and then cleared as they moved cautiously into the frame. It was a man, dressed in dark clothes, wearing a ski mask, and he was holding a sledgehammer. The intruder didn't seem to notice the live camera at first. He glanced around the room, gripping the hammer tightly, and then froze when his eyes landed on the smiling man. But that man, he didn't move an inch. His grin didn't falter and his gaze didn't shift. The intruder hesitated, his posture stiffening. He took a step closer, waved a hand in front of the smiling man's face. Nothing. And then he whispered something, low enough that I couldn't make it out. The smiling man stayed silent, and he didn't even blink. The intruder backed away slowly, muttering to himself, and then turned and bolted out of the frame. I heard the sound of a door slamming shut somewhere off-screen, and for a moment the room was quiet again, except for the faint hum of the camera. The man didn't so much as flinch. I closed the tab, but the image of his frozen, smiling face stayed with me long after. I never went back to that stream, but sometimes I wonder how many people have found it since, and who's really watching who. I remember being 8 years old and my dad bringing home our first home computer. I have very vivid memories of how excited he and my mom were and how Dad let me use MS Paint to get me accustomed to using the mouse. It seemed like a big deal to them, but it was like a positive thing, something they were excited about. But then when we finally got hooked up to the internet, that was a big deal in a whole different kind of way. My dad treated the computer like it was a gift from the gods and the key to the 21st century, which I guess in many ways it was, kind of. But he treated the internet like it was a loaded gun. I later learned that an uncle had warned my mom about how the internet was full of very dark stuff that had warped my young mind. And while I'd say that statement had a whiff of hyperbole about it, I can't say it's completely false either. maybe 6 or 7 years later, when I was finally allowed to surf the internet unsupervised, I discovered a little website you may know as Craigslist. I'm sure like 90% of people know what Craigslist is, and if you don't, you better just Google it or something, but I wasn't revisiting the place for the sales or the personals. I was returning for all the weird info dumps and discussions taking place in the psych and religion sections of the discussion boards. And that's when I discovered the single most disturbing thing I had ever read online. The story of a little girl named Anna, and how even though I thought my uncle was an old prude, making mountains out of molehills, he was actually kind of right about the whole internet being full of weird and very disturbing stuff. So back in 2007, a young Czech man set up one of those video baby monitors in order to check up on his newborn son. But then one night, he switches it on, and instead of seeing his kid asleep in his crib, he sees a boy of around 6 or 7 bound and gagged in the corner of a dirty cellar. Naturally, the guy rushes to call the cops, who deduce that he somehow received the signal of a similarly video-based baby monitor located in a nearby home. The cops then go door to door, trying to figure out where the signal was coming from, and that's when they meet the Morova sisters. The older of the two sisters was the single mother of 2 young boys and had recently adopted a 13-year-old girl named Anna. It was one of those 2 boys the young father had witnessed tied up in the basement. It was a form of punishment, but not one devised by the boy's mother or aunt. It was little Anna's idea, the 13-year-old girl adopted by the older Morova sister. But Anna had not just been manipulating the sisters into brutally punishing the boy. She had been cutting off thin slices of his flesh and then feeding them to the unwitting sisters in their daily meals. And at first, the police believed Anna was just another victim of the sisters' abuse. Yet oddly, the girls didn't show any of the same signs of abuse that the boys had, be it burns, bruises, or scars. The 2 boys confirmed it too, only they were ever subjected to abuse and Anna remained untouched. Somehow, Anna had convinced the 2 boys that they deserved to be punished, which was why they never thought to fight back or otherwise defend themselves. The same was true for the 2 sisters. Somehow, Anna had convinced them that what they were doing was the right thing to do, and neither of them had a history of being abusive until little Anna had showed up on their doorstep. Little Anna was adopted, all right, but the Morova sisters hadn't visited an orphanage or contacted some kind of adoption agency. Little Anna had simply turned up on their doorstep one day and had never left. The cops do some digging on little Anna, trying to find out where she came from, then after months upon months of searching, this is what they discovered. 13-year-old Anna was not 13 years old. She wasn't even named Anna. She was actually in her early 30s. Her name was Barbara, and the only reason she could pass as a young girl was because she had some rare developmental disorder. The cops moved to arrest the woman only to find that she'd fled the country. But thanks to them being able to circulate recent photos of her, she was quickly tracked down and then brought back to the Czech Republic to face justice. It turns out she was in Poland, posing as a 14-year-old boy, and she'd already talked her way into the home of a young family who had, you guessed it, 2 young children. On the Craigslist discussion board, there were all kinds of rumors that Anna's birth parents were connected to some weird cult called the Grail Movement. But even as a teenager, I found the connection to be odd at best. The only thread that held them together was the idea that the movement's goal was to create a kind of meta-Christ, essentially a copy of Jesus with all the same preternatural powers. Supposedly, Anna was this meta-Christ, but then without the proper guidance, she turned rotten and used her powers for evil. The Grail movement was a real thing, and a serious enough movement that the National Socialists went after them after they annexed Austria. But I think people just wanted to tag the 2 subjects together to make the whole thing into some vast, creepy conspiracy, when to me, the whole thing is just scary enough on its own. These days, I think back on it, on what my uncle said about the internet being full of weird, creepy stuff, and I think he's partially right. But it's not the internet that's packed with all of those strange, frightening things. It's the world outside of our windows. real life, the world and the people in it. Those are the really scary things. All websites like Craigslist do is kind of act like a window, which allows all of us to see it, truly. Way back before I moved out of my parents' place, my little cousin spilled Mountain Dew all over my PlayStation and just totally fried the thing. A few hours later, I was scrolling my local Craigslist when, bingo, I see a PS3 for sale for $100. The post said it was in good condition, and the seller claimed that he needed the money urgently. It seemed too good to be true, but since it was the holidays and everywhere was mostly snowed in, I was bored out of my mind and I was desperate. I texted the number listed and the seller replied quickly, suggesting that we meet in the parking lot of a closed-down Kmart on the edge of town. He insisted on cash and stressed the need for a quick transaction because he didn't want to be sitting in his car freezing his butt off. I felt uneasy. I told myself that I'd be careful. As long as I saw the PlayStation 3 before handing over the money, I figured I'd be fine. When I pulled into the lot, it was completely empty, aside from the dark car parked at the far end, and a man in a hoodie leaned against the driver's door. He raised a hand in acknowledgement as I approached and then asked if I had the cash. His tone was casual, almost bored, so it didn't raise any red flags at all for me. I nodded, and then he motioned toward the backseat of his car, saying the PlayStation 3 was there and inviting me to check it out. I stepped out of my car, walked towards his, and then opened the back door. Inside was a box, but something was off. It wasn't sealed, and when I lifted the lid, it wasn't a PlayStation 3. Instead, it was an old, dusty console that looked like it hadn't worked in years. And before I could react, I sensed the guy stepping closer behind me. Then out of nowhere, he pulls a gun from his waistband and tells me to hand over the cash, or I'm dead. The whole time his voice was low and controlled, and he didn't sound remotely nervous. But I felt like I was about to piss my pants as I reached for the envelope in my pocket. As I turned to hand it over, I caught sight of another person in the driver's seat of his car, crouched low and watching very intently. This wasn't just a bad deal. It was a straight-up setup. And when that hit me, it hit me like a punch in the face. I had this gut feeling that they weren't about to let me leave and that the guy's next command was going to be for me to get into his car. Instead of just handing over the money and staying put, I tossed the envelope into the car, then instinctually just bailed. I threw the cash in the hopes they'd be happy with their $100, but then, looking back on it, who robbed someone for just $100? They didn't want the money. They wanted me. And from what they did next, I'm not sure if they cared if I was dead or alive. The first gunshot cracked the air behind me, and then the asphalt kicked up near my feet. I didn't waste a second. I dove from my car, fumbling with my door handle until a second shot followed, louder and sharper and shattering my rear window. I finally got the door closed, started the engine, and then just stomped on the gas, tires screeching as I peeled out of the parking lot as fast as I could. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold the wheel. When I finally made it home, I locked all the doors and sat in the dark for hours, trying to shake off the shock. The shattered glass in my back seat was a grim reminder of just how close I'd come to something far worse, a near miss that could have ended much differently. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams every Sunday and Wednesday nights. I'd love to see you there. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, be gentle I'm a rental.